One of the most obvious symbols of American football is the helmet, and we have had quite an evolution over the years of the helmet, from no helmet to the helmets that we have today of players. They're trying to be safer and safer. Well, today Timothy Brown of Football Archaeology visits to talk about the evolution from leather to plastic. Tim's done the research, and he's going to share it with us in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with pigskindispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of pigskindispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And we like to look down that portal every Tuesday and go into some football archaeology with our friend Tim Brown of that very site, Football Archaeology. Tim Brown, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Hey, Darren. Thanks for having me back. Looking forward to chatting once again.
Yeah, we are really enjoying these Tuesday meetings that we have, and talking about some different aspects of football that are sort of, some of them are a little out there that not directly related to the game. Some are very directly related to the game, but they're all very interesting indeed, and we really appreciate you sharing these with us.
Yeah, I love kind of football in all dimensions, the technical side of the game, the fan experience, how it's handled in the media, and so equipment and uniforms, all that kind of stuff. And so, I just try to approach it from a different place, every couple of days, just, basically try to mix it up, try to do some different things.
Well, I'm glad you said you like to talk about the uniforms and some of the equipment, because I think that's a subject I'd like to discuss today, because you had a recent tidbit out and you called it the transition from leather to plastic. And it's one of those things that's not directly involved in the game of football, but it's such an important element of it and such a big change that happened to the game. And sure like to hear about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the development of plastic helmets and then, metal reinforced, face masks, I think, it was one of the defining elements of today's game. And so, I mean, obviously a lot happened before that, but the game just has changed dramatically as a result of that development. So, I think the thing that maybe people don't recognize is that when the Intercollegiate Football Association effectively word for word adopted the rugby rules in 1876. I mean, they changed 3 or 4 rules, but nothing really significant. But one of the rules that came along from rugby was a rule that said basically that you could not, players could not wear anything that had a hard substance. And they cited a substance called gutta percha, which was some kind of rosin, or, it was basically like what we might think of as an early plastic. And it came off of trees from Indonesia or whatever. But so, anything that was hard could not be worn on the uniform. So, all the protective gear early on was soft leathers, right? So when they had any kind of head harness, it was a softer leather. It was heavily padded, both on the outside and inside. The shoulder pads that they wore were just pads filled with felt and horsehair and things like that. And they did use a little bit of sole leather, which is a harder leather on helmets for a little bit around the turn of the last century. And then they got rid of those. They basically outlawed them. So then, football continued with this no hard substances thing. And then, for decades. And then they kind of started allowing a little bit more sturdy helmets, right? Those tended to be fairly soft on the outside. But then in 1940, Rydell introduced plastic helmets. And Northwestern was the first team to wear them. A few other teams had them early on. And then they also the U.S. Army got a hold of them and actually borrowed helmets from West Point, and then basically modified it. And the Rydell became a supplier to the airborne. So, airborne trainees wore Rydell football helmets when they were jumping out of airplanes. You see images of that here and there. But
so the football helmet preceded the crash helmet that pilots were wearing then.
Yeah. So until then, there were people who tried, if you think about the early guys in planes were flying around like gliders,
Right.
There was if you were going to hit the ground, you were really going to hit the ground. And so, they tried to wear various types of pads on their head, but again, it was more like a football helmet. And a lot of them, you think about the World War I ace and Snoopy and everything, they're just wearing a leather kind of hood. But so they ended up, they started, they used the, because of, World War II supply issues, they really couldn't produce any more civilian helmets. So it really wasn't until after World War II that the helmets kicked in, the plastic ones. And so they were adopted pretty quickly, but there were still a lot of people holding out there, folks who just thought these things are too hard. They're causing a lot of injuries. Most guys didn't wear face masks at the time. So, you got hit in the face by a hard helmet, that didn't feel that good. So, and, that's, I think, part of the reason why additional people started wearing face masks. But yeah, it was just, there was this constant battle of, should we retain more of the rugby element where you don't pad up and then let the game go wherever it goes, or do we try to protect players from what the plastic helmet did was it protected people from skull fractures, right? The leather helmet did that to some extent, but not really. Plastic helmets did do that, but again, came at the cost of, now you're hitting somebody else with a hard plastic helmet. And then coaches started teaching, spearing and things like that. And, then some of the blocking changed to take advantage of the hard helmet. But they eventually, outruled all of that, or outlawed all of that. So anyway, it was just kind of an interesting period of time. And, really, I think basically by like 61, 62, pretty much everybody was switching over to plastic helmets. You could still buy them, but you could still buy leather is what I meant. But typically they're selling, pretty much all leather or all plastic.
So it was such a long period of time to, like over a decade, it sounds like maybe a couple decades for that transition. It wasn't like a wide sweeping change where they, the rules maker said next year, everybody wears plastic helmets. So you had games where probably some participants were wearing leather and some were wearing plastic. Is that true?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And in fact, so that tidbit about the transitioning from leather to plastic, there's an image or two that shows some guys wearing the old leather helmets with the straps, crossing the head or crossing the top of the helmet. And then other guys in what's clearly a plastic helmet. So, I think through probably 1949, 50, you would see a lot of that. And then after that, it became, there were just certain people who just, hey, this is a helmet I always wore. I wore it in high school, so I'm going to continue wearing it. You had guys who didn't wear helmets at all. You had the Tommy McDonalds of the world in the NFL who didn't wear a helmet. But I think there were just some old school coaches who didn't, who just thought that the leather helmet was safer. I think they were wrong, but that's what they thought. So. But the other thing was that the leather helmet, there was like it wasn't a suspension system, but there was padding inside of it. The early plastic helmets were all suspension systems, and I don't know if you ever wore one of those, but I did, and there was,
yeah, I did too.
It didn't offer anywhere near as much protection as the padded and the air-filled ones that, I was able to wear a little bit later. But the other thing that you mentioned about there wasn't a rule that said you had to wear a plastic helmet. That still really didn't come into place. The the National Testing Organization, I think it's people call it NOCSAE, but NOCSAE. It's always got the little stamp on the back of the helmets. That opened its doors in '68, started certifying helmets in '73, and it wasn't until '78 that the NCAA required anyone playing in a game to have one of those stickers on their helmet.
Interesting. That's I didn't realize it was as recent as that. I was thinking it was back in the 50s or 60s, but very interesting.
It was there was a lot of testing. A lot of universities were involved in testing the helmet quality. Wayne State here in the Detroit area was big. Michigan was big on it. North Carolina was big on it. So there were various. Northwestern did a bunch of testing in the early '60s with like sensors to measure how hard, the level of contact and the strength of the hits that were occurring. So, anyways, there was a lot of academic research, and so it wasn't until somewhere in the '70s where they really kind of figured out and had a reasonable set of standards that they could even try to enforce.
Isn't it kind of interesting that sort of the more things change, the more they stay the same? Now we are seeing teams, all the NFL teams, I think, had to wear the Guardian cap over their hard shell, which is a softening. I'm not sure exactly what the material is, but I know it's like deadens any blows that you take to the head, where you have, instead of having that impact, hard plastic to hard plastic, whatever the materials they make them out of now. And it almost goes back to those days of the leather of that impact, but you still have the hard shell underneath it to give that extra protection. So kind of interesting.
I'm actually writing an article on the history of the padded, the external pads, just driven by kind of the prevalence of the Guardian pads. But so it's an interesting thing. There was Cornell did a lot of development work on that, and their students or their players wore, I think it was just a strip through the middle. But the challenge that they had initially with the external padding was that if it's plastic to plastic, it's fairly clean hit. Boom, that's it. Whereas with the padding that they had then, the two helmets stayed in contact with one another and increased the force and increased some of the torque. So that was part of the reason why that never really went forward. And I think that's probably still part of the case, but I'm not enough of a technologist to know that.
Well, just as a side note, I think you probably remember the pro caps in the 1990s. I think a couple of members of the Buffalo Bills wore them. They were sort of like that, almost like a styrofoam, almost like a wrestling mat type material that you'd put over top of the helmet. Those were made or actually founded, a guy about 10 miles from here founded them here near Erie, Pennsylvania, and they were making those. So, but never took off though. Well,
actually, I think material is called Insolite, but that's the stuff that Cornell initially put on top of their helmets, and then Ohio State, Oklahoma, Duke, others used them. That was also, Insolite was the first material used to create the initial wrestling mats that weren't made of horsehair and felt and all that kind of stuff. So there's a connection between the two. I mean, it was
so when I described it as a wrestling mat, I wasn't too far off then. Okay. Very interesting. Well, Tim, you did it once again. You educated us on something that was a little bit off the beaten path that maybe us football fans wouldn't pay attention to, but your keen eye caught another one, and we appreciate that. Why don't you let folks know where they can find more of your material and follow you on social media?
Yeah, so you can just find me at footballarchaeology.com. There's always an option to subscribe, and if you subscribe, you'll get the content into your email box whenever I post anything, which is at least once a day. Otherwise, follow me on Twitter, and again, just look for Football Archaeology, and you should be able to find me.
Okay. Tim Brown, Football Archaeology, thank you very much once again. We'll talk to you next week.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Darren.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.